70 years ago, in October 1945, 850 delegates from 50 countries gathered in the American city of San Francisco for the founding conference of the United Nations. The Second World War had just ended weeks before. The decision to launch the new global body had been taken by the leaders of the victorious Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. The meeting approved the United Nations Charter and established the structures of the UN as they remain today. Addressing the gathering, the US President Harry Truman told delegates, "With this charter, the world can begin to look forward to the time when all worthy human beings may be permitted to live decently as free people." Looking back, the current Secretary-General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, has stated, "The 70th anniversary of the United Nations is an opportunity to reflect, to look back in the UN's history and take stock of its enduring achievements. It's also an opportunity to spotlight where the UN and the international community as a whole needs to redouble its efforts to meet current and future challenges across the three pillars of its work: peace and security, development, and human rights." Taking his advice, we're here today to discuss exactly what that record is. And we're joined in the studio by Ben Donaldson of the United Nations Association in the UK and the author and journalist Victoria Brittain. Welcome both. Ben, could you remind us of the context? The United Nations was very much the child of wartime Allied diplomacy. What was the thinking behind that?
I mean, as you've already mentioned, it was born out of one of the darkest chapters of the history of mankind, and it was, I suppose, actually created to give us an ultimate safety net against a future descent into World War. So, as you mentioned, its first pillar is peace and security, and that has chiefly occupied it for the 70 years since. There's human rights and also development, the other two pillars of the UN's Charter. But I mean, it came out of a spirit of international cooperation, and immense compromises had to be made between states in order to work together to try and stop and to provide us with a framework that would try to stop a descent back into World War.
Victoria, do the structures of the United Nations, as they still exist today, particularly the permanent members of the Security Council, reflect that? And is it a bit of an anachronism?
It's completely an anachronism. I mean, I think that the UN was sort of killed by the Cold War, and it's been killed worse in the last 2 decades by the unipolar war. I think the dominance of the United States within the Security Council and the absolutely absurd mechanism of vetoes is the thing that has really hobbled and prevented the UN from doing its job in the last 20 or 30 years.
I mean, Ben, let's go back to that. I mean, that wartime accord broke down very quickly with the onset of the Cold War, and the United Nations was quite dragged into that, wasn't it, really? I mean, authorising the war in Korea, which was, again, a bad chapter, really, in world history.
I mean, absolutely. It's been a checkered record. It's made huge achievements in some area. For example, eradicating smallpox and the work it does through the World Food Programme, providing food aid to 90 million a year. Or, for example, the work it does vaccinating children. Over 50% of the world's children are vaccinated through UN programmes. So, which is estimated to save around 3 million children per year. So those frontline services have endured, and they are of crucial relevance to vast swathes of the world's population right now. But as Victoria alludes, its structure and its power makeup is reflective of the situation in 1945. And actually, UNA UK is campaigning for reform of the UN, and we think there's lots more political leaders need to be doing to invest in the organisation, actually, to make it more effective and more relevant today.
Well, we'll come back to the question of reform of the UN. I want to take those three pillars, and let's start with peace and security, identified as one of the three pillars, the first one. How is it performed in terms of that?
Well, I mean, this is the darkest chapter. If you look at the record of how they've failed to keep the peace, the UN, and I mean, if you look at Rwanda, you look at Bosnia, you look at Somalia, just Angola, there's example after example of how the UN completely failed the people on the ground. And that was, as Ben alluded, it's because of the politics behind it. The people on the front line trying to keep the peace have not succeeded. and unfortunately a kind of culture of impunity within the peacekeeping sections of the UN have meant that we've had these terrible scandals of rape and corruption within the peacekeepers of the UN.
I mean, that's a very negative portrayal. Do you buy into that?
It's difficult to interpret what went on in Rwanda and Srebrenica as anything other than atrocities that should and could have been foreseen and prevented. But that's picking up on two of actually the worst and most notorious failings of the international community and the UN. But if you look at peace and security more broadly, you could build an argument for the UN having presided over 70 years of relative global peace. And that is notwithstanding the incredible suffering that we're seeing today in Syria and Iraq and various other places in the world. But if you look at conflict-related deaths, for example, the first decade of the 21st century was actually, I think there were a third of conflict-related deaths during that decade in comparison to previous decades. And you look at the work the UN's done that often goes unnoticed to broker peace settlements. I think about 160 different peace settlements have been brokered through the UN, and these are things that could have flared up to another Rwanda or another Srebrenica, but they're actually things that were sort of they were buttoned down before they got out of hand, and right now today the UN's supplying peacekeepers to 16 different countries. And for example, just last month, well actually in August this year in Central African Republic, the UN compound provided vital shelter to thousands of civilians, and which almost definitely averted a slaughter.
We'll come back to that, but let's stick to these three pillars for a moment. The second one is international development, human development. How's it performed on that, Ben?
I mean, the UN has provided us with the international system of human rights that we know today. And the vast majority of countries buy into these human rights, and they've gained a lot of acceptance among global citizens and members of the public around the world. Of course, there are states which flout them, and this is where the idea of global norms comes in. And whilst the UN may not have the sort of the teeth and the ability to actually to police these human rights and the implementation of these human rights, it's a compelling sort of global norm that the UN's helped to create. The very idea of human rights, the very idea of sort of our freedoms, is something that the UN's helped to establish, which actually stigmatizes bad behavior from states and has done a lot to improve our international standards.
Victoria, you've written extensively on human rights. Do you agree with that record?
Well, not quite, I must say. I mean, if you think of the contrast between the on-the-ground work that Ben alluded to earlier of, say, children's health, and that whole area, and the feeding of refugees and so on, that the on-the-ground UN people do, and you contrast that with the absolute defiance of human rights, that just to take an example that you mentioned, what's going on in Iraq, Afghanistan and Syria. You have a whole swathe of the world that is completely destroyed, and it's been destroyed by Western power. And the UN has been absolutely unable to say anything or do anything about that. And the early attempts in the Syrian crisis to have a distinguished citizen of the UN, Lakhdar Brahimi, bring some kind of possibility of meeting between the parties, was never able to be forced through because the politics of the UK and the US in particular meant that it wasn't going to happen.
I mean, isn't that the point? I mean, just take the case of great powers, say the United States. The US will use the UN when it suits and push it aside when it doesn't, as in the case of the two wars it waged in Iraq.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The UN, it's those situations, the hardest situations like Syria when big powers disagree, that the Security Council is gridlocked, and it's very difficult for the UN to move forward on those issues. For
I mean, why is that? Because, I mean, can you just explain the veto? Because that seems to be the obstacle, isn't it?
The veto is something that's existed since the UN was founded in 1945.
But it wasn't used, if I may just point out, it wasn't used till Reagan used it, 70s.
And so it gives China, Britain, America, Russia, and France a very privileged position, a permanent seat on the Security Council, and it means that votes that go through the Security Council, which is where the maintenance of international peace and security is discussed, votes that go through the Security Council need the, as it's phrased, concurring votes of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council.
But surely that's anachronistic in this day and age. I mean, particularly Britain and France as being the sort of 2 great powers of the world.
Yeah, it is anachronistic, but I just have to point out that who uses the veto most is the United States. And where does it use the veto most? In questions in the Middle East. Any criticism of Israel, you always get the United States voting against it. And I think this is the kind of kernel of the powerlessness of the UN Security Council. Of course, it's absolutely absurd that these kind of colonial powers should have this dominance. How you could come to an agreement to do away with the veto for a start and to bring many more powers of a different nature onto the Security Council, I think is a matter of a lot of discussion. I think you're probably involved in some of those discussions.
Absolutely.
You're involved in that?
So UNA UK is campaigning for UN reform, various different issues, but one that's of particular interest to us is Security Council reform, because as Victoria said, the Security Council is anachronistic. There's many ways that we believe it could become more effective. For example, Security Council enlargement, it's not representative of the power structures today and actually of the peoples of the world today. You have huge countries like Brazil and India that are not represented on it, and there's no African nation that's represented on it on a permanent basis.
And for much of its history, the People's Republic of China was represented.
People's Republic of China, yes. So, of course, China is now represented on it as a permanent seat, and there are other methods. The principal problem with UN reform in terms of Security Council enlargement is that actually it requires the agreement of those who hold and those who jealously guard their veto privilege. So that might, the idea of sort of self-interest and the unwillingness to compromise on that might give you an idea as to why UN reform and in particular Security Council enlargement has not come on much.
Well, within 2 short years of the San Francisco conference, the UN was dragged into one of the enduring wounds of political history, which is the creation of the State of Israel and the partition of Palestine. What's the United Nations done to achieve peace in Palestine?
Well, I'm afraid it's been an absolutely disastrous failure for the political reasons that we're all discussing. But I mean, if you look now at what was created at that point was a special organization called UNRWA, which was to look after the welfare and development and reconstruction of the refugees who were pushed out of their country by the creation of Israel. UNRWA has been kept really, really short of money. And in the last few months, there's been crisis after crisis for the funding for UNRWA to look after these refugees. And on that side, I think that it's again, we're back to the people on the ground, that UNRWA on the ground has done an astonishing job with very, very poor funding in education, in health, in looking after refugees, both inside the occupied territories and in the region. But the politics of the Americans constantly voting against what the General Assembly put forward resolutions about the illegality of settlements, for instance. This has completely paralyzed any possibility of moving forward. And in fact, the position has gone absolutely so far away from what was agreed in 1948. And that's because of the United States standing at any price behind Israel. And I think this is one of the really, really crucial failures of the UN.
Well, the Palestinian Authority has achieved some recognition in the United Nations, hasn't it, Ben?
I mean, in the last fortnight, we've seen the raising of the Palestinian flag at UN headquarters, and we've seen Ban Ki-moon make a speech hoping for further recognition of Palestine in terms of its statehood. At the moment, it's got observer status, which gives it some privileges at the UN, but it does not give it full member state status.
Would you like to see that developed?
I mean, of course the flag is great, but it's a symbol, and Ban Ki-moon actually said that. Symbols are important. Yes, they are important, but try telling that to people having their houses demolished in the West Bank, or children in Palestine being put in Israeli military prisons. I mean, for people in Palestine, this is just, it's a lasterplast over a really gaping wound. And without a determination to change the politics behind the UN, it's not going to be able to do anything on these big issues.
I just wanted to turn a moment to the refugee crisis, a growing refugee crisis. I myself visited refugee camps in Lebanon run by UNRWA. Mm-hmm. People were doing a fantastic job, but their funds were really low. I mean, there's an indictment of the fact of governments not paying into the United Nations to help this.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a lack of political leadership and it's a lack of resources. And for example, what you just picked up on. A lot of the spillover from the Syria crisis, we're seeing the World Food Programme struggling to feed millions of people. And, for example, I think it's had to restrict or remove its food support to 1 million people over the last few months. And this is causing people to become more and more desperate, and we wonder why refugees are flowing towards Europe at the rate they are.
I mean, this refugee crisis is an indictment, not just I have to say of the UN, but the European Union and other international bodies. But it's shocking that the UN was set up to deal with this, and we've now got a burgeoning refugee problem globally.
But I think that in a way this comes back to the centre of what we're discussing, how ordinary people respond so well to these kind of crises. And the politics prevents, or governments do not respond well. And the kind of jockeying for position that we see in the EU now for dominance is exactly what's bugged the UN over all these years. And I mean, you absolutely long for really dominant world leadership from somebody like, the way that the Pope has so struck a chord on, for instance, on climate change, much more than the UN has done, and on refugees. And I think that until you get a leadership within the UN of people who are prepared to defy big powers and to call them out on their failures, it's going to be really difficult for grassroots people like your organisation to actually bring about change.
That's an interesting point. I mean, in the 1950s and 1960s, we had political leaders, whatever you think of them, Nehru in India, Tito in Yugoslavia, African leaders, trying to build up a third camp, if you like, a non-aligned camp, which was a counter to, at that time, both the Soviet Union and the USA. We have nothing like that now, do we?
It's the spirit of international cooperation and the trend towards a narrow sort of interpretation of national interest, which is causing problems. For example, with the refugees, the unwillingness for states to actually step up and do what's right, which is short-sighted and which will not result in sort of stability and prosperity, which is what our country needs to provide to its citizens and what the world needs.
I mean, those leaders, I mentioned some of them, but in the 1950s and 60s, they said what they felt, they thought, and they stood up to Washington and, at that time, Moscow, didn't they?
They absolutely did. And I think that what they provided is a moral leadership. I mean, the whole, post-colonial period, many of those countries had, as you said, very great leaders, but they also had a confidence and a determination to change the shape of the world away from the imperial past. And unfortunately, we've gone back so far in the last 30 years, really, since the end of the Cold War, that we need these new leaders to step forward again. And when they do, as recently in Latin America, they immediately come across a very serious neighbour that doesn't want them to show that kind of leadership.
I mean, Ben, just going back to San Francisco, it's very interesting when I was researching this. I mean, the enthusiasm for the United Nations when it was created in the United States, I mean, it's almost inconceivable today.
Yeah.
That's what part of our organisation is working hard to try and change, to make the link between a strong United Nations, an effective United Nations, and the global sort of prosperity and raising of living standards and all those amazing things the UN could deliver if it had the political will of its stakeholders, its countries. The UN is a servant to member states, and actually the UN often gets blamed when things go terribly wrong, but more often than not it's the terrible leadership from political leadership from national governments that are the cause of these problems.
And 70 years on, what are your hopes for the United Nations?
70 years on, my hopes are that if we want to have a safe, fair and sustainable world, we need the UK and other countries around the world to invest in the UN and to recognise that that a stable international system requires a lot of political leadership and a lot of resources. And
what would your ideal structure be for the United Nations if you could achieve reform?
In 20 seconds, the idea. I think. There's several things, but if I had to sum it up, I think Security Council reform is absolutely top of the agenda. It needs to be representative. It needs to ring true and be legitimate to the peoples of the world that it's representing. And I think the position of the Secretary General should be changed, and it should be improved. The process for selecting the next Secretary General, in order to give the UN's next leader greater clout, greater ability to speak truth to power. And part of this is instilling a fair and open process to select the UN's next leader.
Victoria, what's your hopes for the United Nations?
Everything Ben said is, of course, great. You've got to do away with the veto. That has got to be the main demand. It is just completely paralysing the organisation. And you're never going to have a strong leader of the UN as long as you have these dominant countries holding the whole system to ransom.
Now, just in conclusion, I just wanted to say, on a scale of 0 to 10, how do you think the UN has performed over the last 70 years?
You look at it one way and you'd say it's a high number. You look at it another way and you'd say not so well. That's a tricky one. 7?
Well, I would say terribly on the political front, but really well on the grassroots on the ground.
Well, time has finally run out. I'd like to thank our guests, Victoria Brittain and Ben Donaldson, and thank you for joining us. The United Nations was born amidst the hope at the close of the Second World War that it could secure world peace. How far it has succeeded is for you to judge.